From Petrograd came Paul Slavsky, with what his nihilist associates might have styled a clean record and no bungled jobs, but what Larry Brandon classified as a criminal record deluxe. It was natural that such a record should bring about Slavsky's early acquaintance with Inspector Brandon of the Central Office, and it followed, as day follows dawn, that the terrorist should become the object of the shrewdest surveillance the chief inspector could design. Whether Paul Slavsky actually discovered, or merely suspected, that he was being shadowed matters little. A notation on an old blotter shows that he boldly attempted to pave the way for future criminal enterprises by calling at the Central Office in the role of a persecuted citizen, who had journeyed here from his native land to escape the hell which he declared the Russian secret police had made his life. It took 3 months of intensive investigation to convince Larry Brandon that Slavsky was all the secret police had painted him and more, and that the terrorist had not emigrated to America with even the remotest intention of reforming. It took the detective 3 months more to satisfy himself beyond all doubt that Slavsky had, marvelously enough, established an active branch of his old order, and was undoubtedly spreading the doctrine of Gorgias and Fichte under the very noses of the Central Office experts. However, the evidence necessary to a conviction was lacking, so nothing could be done. A little later, the men of the same nationality as the nihilist, whom Brandon had used to great advantage on the case, began, one by one, to drop quietly out of existence. This was not only mysterious, it was uncanny. Finally, the decomposed bodies of some of these operatives were found and unmistakably identified. In each instance, the head had been completely severed from the trunk. Recollecting that the terrorist order, to which Paul Slavsky had belonged, had signalized its outrages by decapitating its victims, Brandon was enabled to initiate definite plans which, in due course, culminated in his running his man to earth. But Paul Slavsky never beheld the fatal chair nor served time. He chose the other route. He had elected to live in rebellion against man's orderly institutions, and in this same unreasoning revolt he resolved to die. Like most of his ilk, the terrorist in physical combat was a hard man, and he really fought a great fight, but he fought it with a master craftsman in the conquering of such as he. And inevitably he lost, with many of Larry Brandon's bullets in his great body, and only life enough left in him to greet, and almost at once to take final leave of his favorite sister, Olga, who had arrived in Europe a little late, as it transpired, to join her brother in his sinister calling. Olga Slavsky, years younger than her lamented brother, was as pretty a little specimen of dark-eyed femininity as ever enchanted fastidious masculine eye. Yet so is the tigress beautiful. Still, that is not quite the idea I wish to convey. If you can think of a woman in repose being as beautiful as a tigress, and in smouldering hate and loathing as repulsive, as hideous as a preying vampire, then you will get nearer my meaning. Olga, like her brother, was a staunch exponent of the terrorist doctrine. What Brandon expected soon came to pass. The strange girl, whom men called beautiful and women envied, was promptly elected to her brother's place in what was known in the underworld of unlawful secret orders as the League. In this way she immediately crossed swords with the man who had ended the career of her brother Paul, and ere long she became aware, through members of the League detailed as spies, that still another noted criminologist, Joe Seagraves, was unpleasantly hot on her trail. But Olga was undaunted. For daring and ingenuity, she by far eclipsed her cunning and resourceful brother, who had blazed the path of her iconoclastic pilgrimage. Since little could thus far be proved against Olga, Seagraves believed that it might be better to declare a sort of armistice, and if possible, gradually win her over to the side of law and order. To this end, he openly called and laid his ideas before her. She frankly flouted his implied interest in her well-being, but showed a spirit of compromise by offering the crime specialist a cigarette. In such a mood, Olga became a docile and purring tiger kitten, only one never quite forgot her claws. She was highly superstitious, Seagraves discovered. But then her whole character was so anomalous, and so replete with unexpectedly outcropping traits and wildly illogical beliefs that it was almost to be expected she would believe in ghosts. She clung tenaciously to the belief, so Brandon told Seagraves that someday Paul would return and end the life of the man who, the terrorist had told his sister shortly before his death, had done him to death. "Do you still believe, Olga, that Paul is going to come back one day and carry Brandon away with him into the unknown?" asked Seagraves. Olga's dark eyes grew suddenly darker as she slowly removed a cigarette from between her two red lips. "Not only is he coming," she answered, "but he is coming soon. Only night before last I talked with him. I tell him hurry. You see, his spirit cannot rest until his murder is, my very bad English, avenge." "You're a very foolish woman, Olga," admonished Seagraves. "If you refuse to listen to my warning, you're going to find yourself in lots of trouble. I want you to understand that." Then the drowsing tigress put out her claws. "You threaten me," she fairly hissed, tossing away her cigarette and rising. "I am a free woman. You are, after all, like my own people. You would make slaves of all who cannot buy their freedom of thought and action." She glanced about queerly before she concluded. "Don't interest yourself too far. You may be great, but remember I am no longer to be despised. You have waited too long. Should I choose, for example, I could have shot you where you sit." Joe Seagraves leaped out of his chair, an automatic in his experienced hand and menacing the mysterious woman steadily. But already the allegorical vampire, which the detective had seen reflected in Olga's piercing eyes and heard in her studied but crisp and stinging words, had spread its skinny wings and flown. Olga was laughing in such sincere, or well-feigned, mockery at his alarm that the dignified detective momentarily felt abashed. He put his weapon away, nevertheless, only after a searching glance about the very ordinary little room in which the extraordinary woman had received him. He recalled that the last victim of Olga's brother, mutilated, headless and repellent, had been found in this same neighborhood, if not in this same house. Please forgive me," the strange girl was pleading. "You see, I forgot that you are not like Brandon. For him there is no forgiveness. He must perish. But we, you and I, why must we be enemies?" "There's but one reason, Olga," replied Seagraves seriously, "and that is a strong one. It is simply the nature of our respective callings." "Then I can only be sorry," she said in a low voice. "Still, my principles are more sacred than your friendship." As the woman paused, Seagraves could have taken an oath that he caught the sound of whispering voices through a door standing slightly ajar not 3 paces from his elbow. Of a sudden, he stepped forward and flung the door wide with a resounding bang. A grey-walled room quite empty was all that rewarded his examination. He turned and found Olga smiling again. "Did you surprise them?" she inquired sweetly. "Surprise whom?" demanded the detective. "The rats," she said ingenuously, still smiling. "I've seen but one rat here," murmured Seagraves in an impersonal tone. "I see it now. It has wings that fold up like an umbrella. It is called a vampire." Olga smiled on placidly, even after Joe Seagraves had closed the door on her and was gone. In the language of the man who knotted the noose, Olga, as her kind are certain to do, came at last to the end of her rope. Conspiracy, blackmail and extortion were at last brought home to her, and it chanced that the same eminent crime expert who had hurried the career of her brother to an inglorious finish was likewise destined to be the instrument of fate in the undoing of Olga. In time the pursuit narrowed down to the end of a most imperfect day for both quarry and hunters. Then all night, as Brandon and Seagraves gradually drew their web closer and ever closer about the elusive terrorist, she tricked them at every angle and turn with the cunning of a fox, and it was not until 3 sleepless days and nights that the 2 renowned sleuths effected her capture more than 500 miles distant from the field of her long, continued operations. "She'll be as slippery as an eel," Brandon warned Seagraves when they were ready to start back with their prisoner. "I'll never consent to any Pullman for her, even though we ignore the law and handcuff her to the seat. One of us is going to have to keep his eyes on her constantly." "Only one of us could sleep at a time, anyhow," said Seagraves. "And surely we can stand it one more night, don't you think? Suppose we both sit it out with her." They at length did decide to sit it out with their prisoner, and with that understanding they took her aboard the train. At the moment of entering the train, a telegram was handed to Brandon, and as soon as the 3 were comfortably seated in their section, the inspector read it with lips compressed and eyes oddly squinted. Then he handed the message to Seagraves, who read, "Police record Olga Slavsky arrived. Wanted in 3 countries for complicity in murder 9 counts. Escaped Russian secret police 3 times, at present fugitive from justice. Keep close watch on her. Renfro, Chief Inspector." Seagraves returned the telegram to Brandon, winking an eye disparagingly and smiling at what the Chief Inspector had evidently considered a necessary precaution. The afternoon waned. Early evening found the train 3/4 of an hour behind time. If this kept up, they would not arrive before 2 in the morning. Olga sat beside Seagraves facing Brandon. "I would give much for a cigarette," she announced out of a long silence at 10 o'clock, addressing herself to Seagraves. "This isn't a smoker," observed the crime specialist, glancing around, "but there are only 2 other passengers in the car. Try it." He offered her his box, and she took one and lighted it. Filling her lungs with the comforting smoke, she exhaled it in a great cloud, and after a meditative pause, murmured, "At last I am to see poor Paul." She looked Seagraves steadily in the eye, and added in a queer tone that she felt her brother was very near tonight. It was a mixed train, and the day coaches appeared to have much the better of the sleepers as to occupancy. Seagraves noted casually that besides themselves, their car boasted but 2 other passengers, and though they might have been snugly asleep in their respective berths, they had apparently elected to sit out the short run, evidently preferring reclining to rising and dressing at 1:30 or 2 o'clock a.m. "Do you see the man sitting all alone in the last seat with the handkerchief over his face to keep the light out of his eyes?" Olga's ruminant voice finally broke in upon the monotonous clackety-clack of wheels upon rail joints. "Yes, what about him?" asked Seagraves. "Nothing. Only he looks like Paul," she answered in a guarded voice, as though she feared Brandon, cat-napping now, might overhear her strange language. "Olga," ridiculed the detective, "get a grip on yourself." Having thus counseled the prisoner, Seagraves was thoughtful for a long space. Then he looked over at Olga, saw an odd, uneasy expression on her pretty face, and quickly said, "Here, have another cigarette, Olga. Burn 'em up." At midnight the conductor passed through the car. "We'll make the city a little before 2 o'clock, he said, in answer to a sleepy-voiced interrogation from Brandon, who seemed to have banished sleep and was blinking about the car. "What, we all alone?" he asked Seagraves. Then he caught sight of the 2 lonely passengers at the far end of the car. "No. 2 others," he murmured, answering his own question. He was turning his gaze away from the man with the handkerchief over his face when something, Seagraves noted, drew his eyes inquiringly back to the sleeper's hunched figure. The movement caused Seagraves to follow Brandon's scrutiny. He marked the fact that the handkerchief had fallen from their fellow passenger's face, and was it because of Olga's suggestion, or was it merely a silly midnight fancy? He assuredly seemed to trace a certain vague resemblance between the solitary sleeper and the notorious Paul Slavsky, long ago dead. The idea brought with it a queer, though distinct, sense of unpleasantness. The booming voice of Brandon, breaking in upon his wholly disagreeable train of thought, was highly reassuring. "Huh," laughed the inspector. "I thought I recognized that chap." At 1:45, Seagrave shook Brandon out of a doze and said, "Keep the lady company for a few minutes. I'm going into the smoker." "All right, Joe," drawled Brandon, opening his slightly reddened eyes and seeming to be perfectly wide awake. Seagraves disappeared into the smoking room, returning some 10 or 15 minutes later. To his surprise, he noted that Brandon, evidently not caring to take a chance on Olga's diving out of the open window, had handcuffed her fast to the seat and had once more fallen asleep. Olga herself appeared a trifle more cheerful. She even smiled, though somewhat wearily, as Seagraves resumed his seat beside her. "I told you it would be Paul," the woman whispered to Seagraves, as though determined to share no part of her secret with the despised Brandon. "See," she continued, growing almost jubilant, "it is my brother Paul come back to me at last." "For God's sake, Olga," cried Seagraves disgustedly, "stop that foolishness. It gets on my nerves." Stillness then for several minutes. Of a sudden Seagraves felt cold. He turned up his coat collar and, somehow rather depressed, sat looking across at the muffled figure of Brandon, who, also evidently having felt the night chill, had wound a great muffler about his neck and pulled his ample Stetson low over his face. Seagraves reflected that this would be a fitting case with which to crown a long list of his old friend's successes. Tomorrow he would congratulate him. A long, wild shriek from the locomotive startled Seagraves like an unexpected blow. "Ha," he said, "I must be developing nerves after all these years. Anyhow, we're getting in." Then he raised his eyes and saw that the man who, he had imagined, resembled Paul Slavsky had disappeared. So had the only other passenger who had occupied a seat near him. It struck Seagraves as singular. Another long wail from the locomotive blent dissonantly with the dreary clackety-clack of the car wheels, and at the same instant the vestibule door was smashed open. Through it came stumbling, covered with blood, clothing torn to tatters, the identical man who had resembled Paul Slavsky. His hands were securely cuffed, and he was being partly shoved and partly dragged forward along the aisle for all the world as though he were a wax dummy. His captor was no other than the traveller whom the detective had seen sitting near the dead terrorist's double. "He fought like a tiger, Mr. Seagraves, but I finally got him. He's one of Olga's bunch, a second brother of hers, in fact. He heard that she was hard-pressed and just landed from Europe to help her escape." Joe Seagraves sat like one stupefied. Jim McLean, of the Central Office, cleverly disguised as an innocent-looking rustic, had captured a third Slavsky. But how, where? "It's all right," McLean was explaining. "You see, Renfrew got wind of this fellow's game, got hold of a picture of him and sent me out to ride back with you and Brandon and the lady. I fell asleep in earnest while pretending to be, and waked up just as my man was slipping out of the car. I got a good look at his face then, and, recognizing him, made the first move in a scrap that lasted through 6 coaches and clear up to the coal tender." "Why was the man slipping out?" demanded Seagraves, perplexedly. "Ah, that's it. I missed you from the car and suspected something wrong. Brandon seemed to be asleep and the woman was laughing. That was enough. I collared my man." Joe Seagraves reached over and gently shook Brandon, who, still sleeping like a rock, had slumped low down in the angle formed by the seat and the window. "Come out of it," the detective bawled at his companion. "We're getting in." But Brandon slept on. Seagraves waited a moment, then shook him again, almost violently. "Come on, Larry. he said, himself rising. But Brandon did not stir, and Seagraves darted a questioning glance at Olga, still handcuffed fast to the seat. To his amazement and alarm, the woman was smiling, triumphantly, terribly. A vague surmise, which had come into Seagraves' head hours before, was now confirmed. There was no doubting that leering and awful smile. She had bitten the blood from her carmine lips. Olga Slavsky had gone stark mad. In all the years that followed, Joe Seagraves was never able to free his memory from the haunting horror of the thing he beheld when, Brandon not reacting to violent shakes, he grew suspicious and lifted his unresponsive friend's big hat off his head, or rather off a vacant-eyed and staring dummy head. Paul Slavsky had not returned as Olga had predicted he would, but a last gruesome reminder of his own hideous handiwork was nevertheless present. When the first shock of horror had passed, and Seagraves and McLean again focused their incredulous eyes on Olga Slavsky, they knew that the woman, though handcuffed, had herself participated in this last act of terrorism in America. It was incredible, but there, before the detectives' eyes, were the facts themselves. The blood from her bitten lips streaking her patrician chin, Olga sat composedly folding and unfolding her daintily patterned hands, quite as a vampire folds and unfolds its repellent wings, toying, as might a child, with the polished handcuffs which supposedly had held her a prisoner, and before the amazed eyes of her beholders, slipping the locked manacles on and off over her tiny, flexible hands. The curious narrative that follows was found among the papers of the late Dr. John Pedrick, psychical investigator and author of occult works. It bears evidences of having been received through automatic writing, as were several of his publications. Unfortunately, there are no records to confirm this assumption, and none of the mediums or assistants employed by him in his research work admits knowledge of it. Possibly, for the doctor was reputed to possess some psychic powers, it may have been received by him. At any rate, the lack of data renders the recital useless as a document for the Society for Psychical Research. It is published for whatever intrinsic interest or significance it may possess. With reference to the names mentioned, it may be added that they are not confirmed by the records of the War Department. It could be maintained, however, that purposely fictitious names were substituted either by the doctor or the communicating entity. They called me, when I walk the earth in a body of dense matter, Richard Devaney. Though my story has little to do with the war, I was killed in the Second Battle of the Marne on July 24th, 1918. Many times, as men were wont to do who felt the daily, hourly imminence of death in the trenches, I had pictured that event in my mind and wondered what it would be like. Mainly I had inclined toward a belief in total extinction, that when the vigorous, full-blooded body I possessed should lie bereft of its faculties, I, as a creature apart from it, should go on, was beyond credence. The play of life through the human machine, I reasoned, was like the flow of gasoline into the motor of an automobile. Shut off that flow, and the motor became inert, dead, while the fluid which had given it power was in itself nothing. And so, I confess, it was a surprise to discover that I was dead and yet not dead. I did not make the discovery at once. There had been a blinding concussion, a moment of darkness, a sensation of falling into a deep abyss. An indefinite time afterward, I found myself standing dazedly on the hillside, toward the crest of which we had been pressing against the enemy. The thought came that I must have momentarily lost consciousness, yet now I felt strangely free from physical discomfort. What had I been doing when that moment of blackness blotted everything out? I had been dominated by a purpose, a flaming desire. Like a flash, recollection burst upon me, and with it, a blaze of hatred, not toward the Boche gunners ensconced in the woods above us, but toward the private enemy I had been about to kill. It had been the opportunity for which I had waited interminable days and nights. In the open formation, he kept a few paces ahead of me. As we alternately ran forward, then dropped on our bellies and fired, I had watched my chance. No one would suspect, with the dozens who were falling every moment under the merciless fire from the trees beyond, that the bullet which ended Lewis Winston's career came from a comrade's rifle. Twice I had taken aim, but withheld my fire, not from indecision, but lest, in my vengeful heat, I might fail to reach a vital spot. When I raised my rifle the third time, he offered a fair target. God, how I hated him! With fingers itching to speed the steel toward his heart, I forced myself to remain calm, to hold fire for that fragment of a second that would ensure careful aim. Then, as the pressure of my finger tightened against the trigger, came the blinding flash, the moment of blackness. I had evidently remained unconscious longer than I realized. Save for a few figures that lay motionless or squirming in agony on the field, the regiment had passed on, to be lost in the trees at the crest of the hill. With a pang of disappointment, I realized that Lewis would be among them. Involuntarily I started onward, driven still by that impulse of burning hatred, when I heard my name called. Turning in surprise, I saw a helmeted figure crouching beside something huddled in the tall grass. No second glance was needed to tell me that the huddled something was the body of a soldier. I had eyes only for the man who was bending over him. Fate had been kind to me. It was Louis. Apparently, in his preoccupation, he had not noticed me. Coolly, I raised my rifle and fired. The result was startling. Louis neither dropped headlong nor looked up at the report. Vaguely, I questioned whether there had been a report. Thwarted, I felt the lust to kill mounting in me with redoubled fury. With rifle upraised, I ran toward him. A terrific swing, and I crashed the stock against his head. It passed clear through. Louis remained unmoved. Uncomprehending, snarling, I flung the useless weapon away and fell upon him with bare hands, with fingers that strained to rend and tear and strangle. Instead of encountering solid flesh and bone, they too passed through him. Was it a mirage? A dream? Had I gone crazy? Sobered, for a moment forgetful of my fury, I drew back and tried to reduce the thing to reason. Was Louise but a figment of the imagination, a phantom? My glance fell upon the figure beside which he was sobbing incoherent words of entreaty. I gave a start, then looked more closely. The dead man, for there was no question about his condition, with a bloody shrapnel wound in the side of his head, was myself. Gradually the import of this penetrated my consciousness. Then I realized that it was Louis who had called my name, that even now he was sobbing it over and over. The irony of it struck me at the moment of realization. I was dead. I was the phantom. Who had meant to kill Louis? I looked at my hands, my uniform. I touched my body. Apparently I was as substantial as before the shrapnel buried itself in my head. Yet, when I had tried to grasp Louis, my hand seemed to encompass only space. Louis lived, and I was dead. The discovery for a time benumbed my feeling toward him. With impersonal curiosity, I saw him close the eyes of the dead man. The man who, somehow or other, had been me. I saw him search the pockets and draw forth a letter I had written only that morning, a letter addressed to... With a sudden surge of dismay, I darted forward to snatch it from his hands. He should not read that letter. Again I was reminded of my impalpability. But Louis did not open the envelope, although it was unsealed. He read the superscription, kissed it as sobs rent his frame, and thrust the letter inside his khaki jacket. "Dick, buddy," he cried brokenly, best pal man ever had. How can I take this news back to her? My lips curled. To Louis, I was his pal, his buddy. Not a suspicion of the hate I bore him, had borne him ever since I discovered in him a rival for Velma Roth. Oh, I had been clever. It was our unselfish friendship that endeared us both to her. A sign of jealousy, of ill nature, and I would have forfeited the paradise of her regard that apparently I shared with Louis. I had never felt secure of my place in that paradise. True, I could always awaken a response in her, but I must put forth effort in order to do so. He held her interest, it seemed, without trying. They were happy with each other and in each other. Our relations might be expressed by likening her to the water of a placid pool, Louis to the basin that held her, me to the wind that swept over it. By exerting myself, I could agitate the surface of her nature into ripples of pleasurable excitement, could even lash her emotion into a tempest. She responded to the stimulation of my mood, yet, in my absence, settled contentedly into the peaceful comfort of Louis's steadfast love. I felt vaguely then, and am certain now, with a broader perspective toward realities, that Velma intuitively recognized Louis as her mate, yet feared to yield herself to him because of my sway over her emotional nature. When the Great War came, we all, I am convinced, felt that it would absolve Velma from the task of choosing between us. Whether the agony that spoke from the violet depths of her eyes when we said goodbye was chiefly for Louis or for me, I could not tell. I doubt if she could have done so. But in my mind was the determination that only one of us should return, and Louis would not be that one. Did I feel no repugnance at thought of murdering the man who stood in my way? Very little. I was a savage at heart, a savage in whom desire outweighed anything that might stand in the way of gaining its object. From my point of view, I would have been a fool to pass the opportunity. Why I should have so hated him, a mere obstacle in my path, I do not know. It may have been due to a prescience of the intangible barrier his blood would always raise between Velma and me, or to a slumbering sense of remorse. But speculation aside, here I was in a state of being that the world calls death, while Louis lived, was free to return home, to claim Velma, to flaunt his possession of all that I held precious. It was maddening. Must I stand idly by, helpless to prevent this? I have wondered since how I could remain so long in touch with the objective world, why I did not at once, or very soon, find myself shut off from earthly sights and sounds as those in physical form are shut off from the things beyond. The matter seems to have been determined by my will. Like weights of lead, envy of Louis and passionate longing for Velma held my feet to the sphere of dense matter. Vengeful, despairing, I watched beside Louis, when at last he turned away from my body and, with tears streaming from his eyes, began to drag a useless leg toward the trenches we had left. I realized why he had not gone on with the others to the crest of the hill. He, too, was a victim of Boche gunnery. I walked beside the stretcher-bearers when they had picked him up and were conveying him toward the base hospital. Throughout the weeks that followed, I hovered near his cot, watching the doctors as they bound up the lacerated tendons in his thigh, and missing no detail of his battle with the fever. Over his shoulder I read the first letter he wrote home to Velma, in which he gave a belated account of my death, dwelling upon the glory of my sacrifice. "I have often thought that you two were meant for each other," he wrote, "and that if it had not been for fear of hurting me, you would have been his wife long ago. He was the best buddy a man ever had. If only I could have been the one to die. Had I known it, I could have followed this letter across seas, could in fact have passed it, and by an exercise of the will have been at Velma's side in the twinkling of an eye. But my ignorance of the laws of the new plane was total. All my thoughts were centered upon a problem of entirely different character. Never was hold upon earthly treasure more reluctantly relinquished than was my hope of possessing Velma. Surely death could not erect so absolute a barrier. There must be a way, some loophole of communication, some chance for a disembodied man to contend with his corporeal rival for a woman's love. Slowly, very slowly, dawned the light of a plan. So feeble was the glimmer that it would scarcely have comforted one in less desperate straits, but to me it appeared to offer a possible hope. I set about methodically, with infinite patience, evolving it into something tangible, even though I had but the most indefinite idea of what the outcome might be. The first suggestion came when Louis had so far recovered that but little trace of the fever remained. One afternoon, as he lay sleeping, the mail distributor handed a letter to the nurse who happened to be standing beside his cot. She glanced at it, then tucked it under his pillow. The letter was from Velma, and I was hungry for the contents. I did not then know that I could have read it easily, sealed though it was. In a frenzy of impatience, I exclaimed, "Wake up, confound it, and read your letter." With a start, he opened his eyes. He looked around with a bewildered expression. "Under your pillow!" I fumed. "Look under your pillow!" In a dazed manner, he put his hand under the pillow and drew forth the letter. A few hours later, I heard him commenting on the experience to the nurse. "Something seemed to wake me up," he said, "and I had a peculiar impulse to feel under the pillow. It was just as if I knew I would find the letter there." The circumstances seemed as remarkable to me as it did to him. It might be coincidence, but I determined to make a further test. A series of experiments convinced me that I could, to a very slight degree, impress my thoughts and will upon Louis, especially when he was tired or on the borderland of sleep. Occasionally I was able to control the direction of his thoughts as he wrote home to Velma. On one occasion, he was describing for her a funny little French woman who visited the hospital with a basket that always was filled with cigarettes and candy. Last time, he wrote, she brought with her a boy whom she called... He paused, with pencil upraised, trying to recall the name. A moment later, he looked down at the page and stared with astonishment. The words, "She called him Maurice," had been added below the unfinished line. "I must be going daffy," he muttered. "I'd swear I didn't write that." Behind him, I stood rubbing my hands in triumph. It was my first successful effort to guide the pencil while his thoughts strayed elsewhere. Another time he wrote to Velma, "I've a strange feeling. Lately that dear old Dick is near. Sometimes, as I wake up, I seem to remember vaguely having seen him in my dreams. It's as if his features were just fading from view." He paused here so long that I made another attempt to take advantage of his abstraction. By an effort of the will that it is difficult to explain, I guided his hand into the formation of the words, "With a jug full of kisses for Winky, as ever her." Just then, Louis looked down. "Good God!" he exclaimed as if he had seen a ghost. Winky was a pet name I had given Velma when we were children together. Louis always maintained there was no sense in it, and refused to adopt it, though I frequently called her by the name in later years, and of his own volition, Louis would never have mentioned anything so convivial as a jugful of kisses. So through the weary months before he was invalided home, I worked. When he left France at the debarkation point, he still walked on crutches, but with the promise of regaining the unassisted use of his leg before very long. Throughout the voyage, I hovered near him, sharing his impatience, his longing for the one we both held dearest. Over the exquisite pain of the reunion, at which I was present, yet not present, I shall pass briefly. More beautiful than ever, more appealing with her vivid, deep colouring, Velma in the flesh was a vision that stirred my longing into an intense flame. Louis limped painfully down the gangplank. When they met, she rested her head silently on his shoulder for a moment, then, her eyes brimming with tears, assisted him, with the tender solicitude of a mother, to the machine she had in waiting. 2 months later they were married. I felt the pain of this less deeply than I would have done had it not been essential to my designs. Whatever vague hope I may have had, however, of vicariously enjoying the delights of love were disappointed. I could not have explained why. I only knew that something barred me from intruding upon the sacred intimacies of their life, as if a defensive wall were interposed. It was baffling, but a very present fact, against which I found it useless to rebel. I have since learned, but no matter. This had no bearing on my purpose, which hinged upon the ability I was acquiring of influencing Louis's thoughts and actions, of taking partial control of his faculties. The occupation into which he drifted, restricted in choice as he was by the stiffened leg, helped me materially. Often, after an interminable shift at the bank, he would plod home at night with brain so weary and benumbed that it was a simple matter to impress my will upon him. Each successful attempt, too, made the next one easier. The inevitable consequence was that in time Velma should notice his aberrations and betray concern. "Why did you say to me, when you came in last night, 'There's a blue billy goat on the stairs'? I wish they'd drive him out," she demanded one morning. He looked down shamefacedly at the tablecloth. "I don't know what made me say it. I seemed to want to say it, and that was the only way to get it off my mind. I thought you'd take it as a joke." He shifted his shoulders, as if trying to dislodge an unpleasant burden. "And was that what made you wear a necktie to bed?" she asked, ironically. He nodded an affirmative. I knew it was idiotic, but the idea kept running in my mind. It seemed as if the only way I could go to sleep was to give in to it. "I don't have these freaks unless I'm very tired." She said nothing more at the time, but that evening she broached the subject of his looking for an opening in some less sedentary occupation, a subject to which she thereafter constantly recurred. Then came a development that surprised and excited me with its possibilities. Exhausted, drained to the last drop of his nerve force, Louis was returning late one night from the bank, following the usual month-end overtime grind. As he walked from the car line, I hovered over him, subduing his personality, forcing it under control, with the effort of will I had gradually learned to direct upon him. The process can only be explained in a crude way. It was as if I contended with him, sometimes successfully, for possession of the steering wheel of the human car that he drove. Velma was waiting when we arrived. As Louis's feet sounded on the threshold of their apartment, she opened the door, caught his hands, and drew him inside. At the action I felt inexplicably thrilled. It was as if some marvelous change had come over me. And then, as I met her gaze, I knew what that change was. I held her hands in real flesh and blood contact. I was looking at her with Louis' sight. The shock of it cost me what I had gained. Shaken from my poise, I felt the personality I had subdued regain its sway. The next moment, Louis was staring at Velma in bewilderment. Her eyes were filled with alarm. You frightened me," she gasped, withdrawing her hands, which I had all but crushed. "Louis, dear, don't ever look at me again like that." I can imagine the devouring intensity of gaze that had blazed forth from the features in that brief moment when they were mine. From this time, my plans quickly took form. 2 modes of action presented themselves. The first and more alluring, however, I was forced to abandon. It was none other than the wild dream of acquiring exclusive possession of Louis' body, of forcing him down, out, and into the secondary place I had occupied. Despite the progress I had made, this proved inexpressibly difficult. For one thing, there seemed an affinity between Louis' body and his personality, which forced me out when he was moderately rested. This bond I might have weakened, but there were other factors. One was the growing conviction on his part that something was radically wrong. With a faculty I had discovered of putting myself en rapport with him and reading his thoughts, I knew that at times he feared that he was going insane. I once had the experience of accompanying him to an alienist, and there, like the proverbial fly on the wall, overhearing learned scientific names applied to my efforts, the alienist spoke of dual personality, amnesia, and the subconscious mind, while I laughed in my, shall I say, ghostly sleeve. But he advised Louis to seek a complete rest, and, if possible, to go into the country to build up physically, which was what I desired most to prevent. I could not play the Mr. Hyde to his Dr. Jekyll if Louis maintained his normal virility. Velma's fears, too, I knew were growing more acute. As insistently as she could, without betraying too openly her alarm, she pressed him to give up the bank position and seek work in the open air, work that would prove less devitalizing to a person of his peculiar temperament. One of the results of debility from overwork is, apparently, that it deprives the victim of his initiative, makes him fearful of giving up his hold upon the meagre means of sustenance that he has, lest he shall be unable to grasp another. Louis was in debt, earning scarcely enough for their living expenses, too proud to let Velma help as she longed to do, his game leg putting him at a disadvantage in the industrial field. In fact, he was in just the predicament I desired, but I knew that in time her wishes would prevail. The circumstances, however, that deprived me of all hope of completely usurping his place was this: I could not, for any length of time, face the gaze of Velma's eyes. The personified truth, the purity that dwelt in them, seemed to dissolve my power, to beat me back into the secondary relationship I had come to occupy toward Louis. He was sometimes tempted to tell her, "You give me my one grip on sanity." I have witnessed his panic at the thought of losing her, at the thought that some day she might give him up in disgust at his aberrations and abandon him to the formless thing that haunted him. Curious, to be of the world and yet not of it, to enjoy a perspective that reveals the hidden side of effects, which seems so mysterious from the material side of the veil. But I would gladly have given all the advantages of my disembodied state for 1 hour of flesh and blood companionship with Velma. My alternative plan was this: if I could not enter her world, what was to prevent me from bringing Velma into mine? Daring? To be sure. Unversed as I was in the laws that govern this mystery of passing from the physical into another state of existence, I could only hope that the plan would work. It might. And that was enough for me. I took a gambler's chance. By risking all, I might gain all. The thought of what I might gain transported me to a heaven of pain and ecstasy. Velma and I, in a world apart, a world of our own, free from the sordid trammels that mar the perfection of the rosiest earth existence. Velma and I, together through all eternity. This much reason I had for hoping. I observed that other persons passed through the change called death, and that some entered a state of being in which I was conscious of them and they of me. Uninteresting creatures they were, almost wholly preoccupied with their former earth interests, but they were as much in the world as I had been in the world of Velma and Louise, before that fragment of shrapnel ruled me out of the game. A few, it was true, on passing from their physical habitations, seemed to emerge into a sphere to which I could not follow. This troubled me. Velma might do likewise, yet I refused to admit the probability, refused to consider the possible failure of my plan. The very intensity of my longing would draw her to me. The gulf that separated us was spanned by the grave. Once Velma had crossed to my side of the abyss, there would be no going back to Louis. Yet I was cunning. She must not come to me with overpowering regrets that would cause her to hover about Louis as I now hovered about her. If I could inspire her with horror and loathing for him, if if I only could. As a preliminary step, I must induce Louis to buy the instrument with which my purpose was to be accomplished. This was not easy, for on nights when he left the bank during shopping hours, he was sufficiently vigorous to resist my will. I could work only through suggestion. In a pawnshop window that he passed daily, I had noticed a revolver prominently displayed. My whole effort was concentrated upon bringing this to his attention. The second night, he glanced at the revolver but did not stop. 3 nights later, drawn by a fascination for which he could not have accounted, he paused and looked at it for several minutes, fighting an urge that seemed to command, "Step in and buy. When, a few evenings later, he arrived home with the revolver and a box of cartridges that the pawnbroker had included in the sale, he put them hastily out of sight in a drawer of his desk. He said nothing about his purchase, but the next day Velma came across the weapon and questioned him regarding it. Visibly confused, he replied, "Oh, I thought we might need something of the sort. Saw it in a window, and the notion of having it sort of took hold of me. There's been a lot of housebreaking lately, and it's just as well to be prepared." And now, with impatience, I waited for the opportunity to stage my denouement. It came, naturally, at the end of the month, when Louis, after a prolonged day's work, returned home, soon after midnight, his brain benumbed with poring over interminable columns of figures. When his feet ascended the stairs to his apartment, it was not his faculties that directed them, but mine, cunning, alert, aflame with deadly purpose. Never was more weird preliminary to a murder. The entering, in guise of a dear, familiar form, of a fiend incarnate, intent upon destroying the flower of the home. I speak of a fiend incarnate, even though I was that fiend, for I did not enter Louis's body in full expression of my faculties. Taking up physical life, my recollection of existence as a spirit entity was always shadowy. I carried through the dominating impulses that had actuated me on entering the body, but scarcely more. And the impulse I had carried through that night was the impulse to kill. With utmost caution I entered the bedroom. My control of Louis's body was complete. I felt, for perhaps the first time, so corporally secure that the vague dread of being driven out did not oppress me. The room was dark, but the soft, regular breathing of Velma, asleep, reached my ears. It was like the invitation that rises in the scent of old wine which the lips are about to quaff, quickening my eagerness and setting my brain on fire. I did not think of love. I lusted, but my lust was to destroy that beautiful body, to kill. However, I was cunning. With caution, I felt my way toward the desk and secured the revolver, filling its chambers with leaden emissaries of death. When all was in readiness, I switched on the light. She wakened almost instantly. As the radiance flooded the room, a startled cry rose to her lips. It froze, unuttered, as, half rising, she met my gaze. Her beauty, the raven blackness of her hair falling over her bare shoulders and full, heaving bosom, fanned the flame of my gory passion into fury. In an ecstasy of triumph, I stood drinking in the picture, while I temporized with the lust to kill, prolonging the exquisite sensation. She was battling for self-control. Louis. The name was gasped through bloodless lips. Involuntarily, I shrank, reeling a little under her gaze. A dormant something seemed to rise in feeble protest at what I sought to do. The leveled revolver wavered in my hand, but the note of panic in her voice revived my purpose. I laughed, mockingly. "Louis!" Her tone was sharp, but edged with terror. "Louis! Put down that pistol. You don't know what you are doing." She struggled to her feet, and now stood before me. God! How beautiful! How tempting that bare white bosom! Put down that pistol, she ordered hysterically. She was frantic with fear, and her fear was like the blast of a forge upon the white heat of my passion. I mocked her. A shrill, maniacal laugh burst from my throat. She had said I didn't know what I was doing. Oh, yes, I did. I'm going to kill you, I shrieked, and laughed again. She swayed forward like a wraith as I fired. Or perhaps that was the trick played by my eyes as darkness overwhelmed me. A few fragmentary pictures stand out in my recollection like clear-etched cameos on the scroll of the past. One is of Louis, standing dazedly, slightly swaying as with vertigo, looking down at the smoking revolver in his hand. On the floor before him, a crumpled figure in ebony and white and vivid crimson. Then a confusion of frightened men and women in oddly assorted nondescript attire. Uniformed officers bursting into the room and taking the revolver from Louis's unresisting hand. Clumsy efforts at lifting the white-robed body to the bed. A crimson stain spreading over the sheet. A doctor, attired in collarless shirt and wearing slippers, bending over her. Finally, after a lapse of hours, a hushed atmosphere. Efficient nurses, the beginning of delirium. And one other picture, of Louis cringing behind the bars of his cell, denied the privilege of visiting his wife's bedside. Crushed, dreading the hourly announcement of her death, filled with unspeakable horror of himself. Velma still lived. The bullet had pierced her left lung, and life hung by a tenuous thread. Hovering near, I watched with dispassionate interest the battle for life. For the time I seemed emotionally spent. I had made a supreme effort. Events would now take their inevitable course and show whether I had accomplished my purpose. I felt neither anxious nor overjoyed, neither regretful nor triumphant, merely impersonally curious. A fever set in lessening Velma's slender chances of recovery. In her delirium, her thoughts seemed always of Louis. Sometimes she breathed his name pleadingly, tenderly, then cried out in terror at some fleeting rehearsal of the scene in which he stood before her, the glitter of insanity in his eyes, the levelled revolver in his hand. Again she pleaded with him to give up his work at the bank, and at other times she seemed to think of him as over on the battlefields of Europe. Only once did she apparently think of me, when she whispered the name by which I had called her Winky, and added, "Dick," but, save for this exception, it was always Louis. Her constant reiteration of his name finally dispelled the apathy of my spirit. Louis. All the vengeful fury toward him I had experienced when my soul went hurtling into the region of the disembodied returned with thwarted intensity. When Velma's fever subsided, when the long fight for recovery began, and she fluttered from the borderland back into the realm of the physical, when I knew I had failed, balked of my prey, I had at least this satisfaction. Never again would these two, the man I hated and the woman for whom I hungered, never again would they be to each other as they had been in the past. The perfection of their love had been irretrievably marred. Never would she meet his gaze without an inward shrinking. Always on his part, on both their parts, there would be an undercurrent of fear that the incident might recur, a grisly menace, poisoning each moment of their lives together. I had not schemed and contrived, and dared, in vain. This was the thought I hugged when Louis was released from jail, upon her refusal to prosecute. It caused me sardonic amusement when, in their first embrace, the tears of despair rained down their cheeks. It recurred when they began their pitiful attempt to build anew on the shattered foundation of love. And then, creepingly, slyly, like a bird of ill omen casting the shadow of its silent wings over the landscape, came retribution. Many times, In retrospect, I lived over that brief hour of my return to physical expression, my hour of realization. Wraith-like arose a vision of Velma. Velma as she had stood before me that night, staring at me with horror. I saw the horror deepen to abject despair. How beautiful she had looked, but when I tried to picture that beauty, I could recall only her eyes. It mattered not whether I wished to see them, they filled my vision. They seemed to haunt me. From being vaguely conscious of them, I became acutely so. Disconcertingly, they looked out at me from everywhere, eyes brimming with fear, eyes fixed and staring, filled with horrified accusation. The beauty I had once coveted became a thing forbidden, even in memory. If I sought to peer through the veil as formerly, to witness her pathetic attempts to resume the old life with Louis, again those eyes. It may perhaps sound strange for a disembodied creature, one whom you would call a ghost, to wail of being haunted. Yet haunting is of the spirit, and we of the spirit world are immeasurably more subject to its conditions than those whose consciousness is centered in the material sphere. God, those eyes! There is a refinement of physical torture which consists of allowing water to fall, drop by drop, for an eternity of hours, upon the forehead of the victim. Conceive of this torture increased 1,000-fold, and a faint idea may be gained of the torture that was mine, from seeing everywhere, constantly, interminably, two orbs ever filled with the same expression of horror and reproach. Much have I learned since entering the land of the shades. At that time I did not know, as I know now, that my punishment was no affliction from without, but the simple result of natural law. Causes set in motion must work out their full reaction. The pebble, cast into a quiet pool, makes ripples which in time return to the place of their origin. I had cast more than a pebble of disturbance into the harmony of human life, and through my intense preoccupation in a single aim had delayed longer than usual the reaction. I created for myself a hell. Inevitably, I was drawn into it. Gone was every desire I had known to hover near the two who had so long engrossed my attention. Haunted, harried, scourged by those dreadful accusers, I sought to fly from them to the ends of the earth. There was no escape, yet driven frantic, I still struggled to escape, because that is the blind impulse of suffering creatures. The emotions that had so swayed me when I tried to blast the lives of two, who held me dear now, seemed puny and insignificant in comparison with my suffering. No physical torment can be likened to that, which engulfed me until my very being was but a seething mass of agony. Through it I hurled maledictions upon the world, upon myself, upon the Creator. Horrible blasphemies I uttered. And at last I prayed. It was but a cry for mercy, the inarticulate appeal of a tortured soul for surcease of pain. But suddenly a peace seemed to have come upon the universe. Bereft of suffering, I felt like one who has ceased to exist. Out of the silence came a wordless response. It beat upon my consciousness like the buffeting of the waves. Words known to human ears would not convey the meaning of the message that was borne upon me. Whether from outside source or welling up from within, I do not know. All I know is that it filled me with a strange hope. 1,000 years or a single instant, for time is a relative thing. The respite lasted. Then I sank, as it seemed, to the old level of consciousness, and the torment was renewed. Endure it now I knew that I must, and why. A strange new purpose filled my being. The light of understanding had dawned upon my soul, and so I came to resume my vigil in the home of Velma and Louis. A brave heart was Velma's, dauntless and true. With the effects of the tragedy still apparent in her pallor and weakness, and in the shaken demeanor and furtive, self-distrustful attitude of Louis, she yet succeeded in finding a place for him as overseer of a small country estate. I have said that I ceased to feel the torment of passion for Velma in the greater torment of her reproach. But I had never ceased to love her. As I now realized, I had desecrated that love, had transmuted it into a horrible travesty, had, in my abysmal ignorance, sought to obtain what I desired by destroying it, yet, beneath all, I had loved. Well, I know, now, that had I succeeded in my intention toward her, Velma would have ascended to a sphere utterly beyond my comprehension. Merciful fate had diverted my aim, had made possible some faint restitution. I returned to Velma, loving her with a love that had come into its own, a love unselfish, untainted by thought of possession. But, to help her, I must again hurt her cruelly. Out of the chaos of her life she had slowly restored a semblance of harmony. Almost she succeeded in convincing Louis that their old peaceful companionship had returned, but to one who could read her thoughts, the nightmare thing that hovered between them weighed cruelly upon her soul. She was never quite able to look into her husband's eyes without a lurking suspicion of what might lie in their depths, never able to compose herself for sleep without a tremor, lest she should wake to find herself confronted by a fiend in his form. I had done my work only too well. Now, slowly and inexorably, I began again undermining Louis's mental control. The old ground must be traversed anew, because he had gained in strength from the respite I had allowed him, and his outdoor life gave him a mental vigor with which I had not been obliged to contend before. On the other hand, I was equipped with new knowledge of the power I intended to wield. I shall not relate again the successive stages by which I succeeded, first in influencing his will, then in partially subduing it, and, finally, in driving his personality into the background for indefinite periods. The terror that overwhelmed him when he realized that he was becoming a prey to his former aberrations may be imagined. To shield Velma, I performed my experiments, when possible, while he was away from her. But she could not long be unaware of the moodiness, the haggard droop of his shoulders which accompanied his realization that the old malady had returned. The deepening terror in her expression was like a scourge upon my spirit. But I must wound her in order to cure. More than once, I was forced to exert my power over Louis to prevent him from taking violent measures against himself. As I gained the ascendancy, a determination to end it all grew upon him. He feared that unless he took himself out of Velma's life, the insanity would return and force him again to commit a frenzied assault upon the one he held most dear. Nor could he avoid seeing the apprehension in her manner that told him she knew, the shrinking that she bravely tried to conceal. Though my power over him was greater than before, it was intermittent. I could not always exercise it. I could not, for example, prevent his borrowing a revolver one day from a neighboring farmer on pretense of using it against a marauding dog that had lately visited the poultry yard. Though I knew his true intention, the utmost that I could do, for his personality was strong at the time, was to influence him to postpone the deed he contemplated. That night I took possession of his body while he slept. Velma lay, breathing quietly, in the next room, for as this dreaded thing came upon him they had, through tacit understanding, come to occupy separate bedrooms. Partially dressing, I stole downstairs and out to the tool shed where Louis, fearing to trust it near him in the house, had hidden the revolver. As I returned, my whole being rebelled at the task before me. Yet it was unavoidable, if I would restore to Velma what I had wrenched from her. Quietly though I entered her room, a gasp, or rather a quick, hysterical intake of breath, warned me that she had wakened. I flashed on the light, She made no sound. Her face went white as marble. The expression in her eyes was that which had tortured me into the depths of a hell more frightful than any conceived by human imagination. A moment I stood swaying before her with levelled revolver, as I had stood on that other occasion months before. Slowly, I lowered the revolver and smiled. Not as Louis would have smiled, but as a maniac, formed in his likeness, would have smiled. Her lips framed the word Louis, but in the grip of despair, she made no sound. It was the despair not merely of a woman who felt herself doomed to death, but of a woman who consigned her loved one to a fate worse than death. Still I smiled, with growing difficulty, for Louis' personality was restive, and my time in the usurped body was short. In that moment I was not anxious to give up his body. At this new glimpse of her beauty through physical sight, my love for Velma flamed into hitherto unrealized intensity. For an instant my purpose in returning was forgotten. Forgotten was the knowledge of the ages which I had sipped since last I occupied the body in which I faced her. Forgotten was everything save Velma. As I took a step forward, my arms outstretched, my eyes expressing God knows what depth of yearning, she uttered a scream. Blackness surged over me. I stumbled. I was being forced out. Out! That cry of terror had vibrated through the soul of Louis, and he was struggling to answer it. Instinctively, I battled against the darkness, clung to my hard-won ascendancy. A moment of conflict, and again I prevailed. Once more I smiled. The effect of it must have been weird, for I was growing weaker, and Louis had returned to the attack with overwhelming persistence. My tongue strove for expression. Sorry. Winky. It won't happen again. I'm not coming back. When I recovered from the momentary unconsciousness that accompanies transition from the physical to spiritual, Louis was looking in affright at the huddled figure of Velma, who had fainted away. The next instant, he had gathered her in his arms. Though I had come near failing in the attempt to deliver my message, I had no fear that my visit would prove in vain. With clear prescience, I knew that my utterance of that old familiar nickname, Winky, would carry untold meaning to Velma, that hereafter she would fear no more what she might see in the depths of her husband's eyes, that with a return of her old confidence in him, the spectre of apprehension would be banished forever from their lives. Gordon Page is dead now, and surely there can be no harm in giving to the world this mad story, contained in the manuscript he left behind. Many will think that the man was mad. Many will believe that he was attempting to perpetrate an immense and grotesque hoax. I do not know. I do know that Gordon always impressed me as the sanest of men, and surely he never seemed a man to father so strange and horrible a practical joke. But it is not for me to tell you what I believe, or attempt to force upon you my own opinion. Rather I shall offer the story as he left it, and let you interpret it as a joke or a madman's dream, or a remarkable document from that mysterious border realm of which we know so little. What is soul? Who can define it? What is that intangible quality that makes me what I am, that brands me as a creature distinct, individual, with an entity that is my own and none other's? Who can answer? I do not know. I can only tell you my story, the story of Malcolm Ray, and ask that you give it what credence you can. It was 2 years ago that I bade Jane Kavanagh good-bye at the railway station in our little hometown of Radford. She was weeping, and clumsily I tried to comfort her. "I shan't be gone long, dearest," I said. "A year isn't long. I'll be back in June, when my work is done. Then we'll be married, and we'll never be separated again." "I know," she answered. "I'm foolish." She smiled up at me bravely, an April smile, with the tears still glistening in her brown eyes. "But I've been frightened, somehow. It seems so far, up in that cold wilderness, and I've had you such a short time. I won't be foolish again." The northbound train began to move, and for the last time I caught her in my arms and pressed my lips to hers. "In June, dear, I'll be back. I promise. Don't worry," I said again, as I swung upon the step of the Pullman. She was smiling that brave April smile, and I watched her until the train carried me beyond sight of her. Northward we went, Dan Murdoch and I. Somewhere in those barren mountains in the untrammeled northwest of Canada, a grizzled old prospector had unearthed a store of that precious stuff, tungsten. Murdoch and I had been sent by our government to investigate it, determine its value, its quantity, and report. It was a long task that awaited us. August was already upon us. The road inland was long and hard. It would be winter when we reached the prospect, spring before we could hope to complete our data and return. 4 days took us to the end of the railroad, a station tumbled in the midst of scarce broken prairie and timberland. There we met the prospector, a shriveled, wiry, hairy old man, marked indelibly with the brand that men bear who have lived much in solitude. From there our trail led northwest. Up waterways we pressed, across silent, silver lakes, hemmed in to the very brim with an untouched growth of pine and spruce, across portages, where streams thundered down precipitous canyons while we laboriously transported canoe and duffel through the timber, following faint paths that told plainly how rarely they had known human footprints. August passed a series of long days filled only with the toil of paddle and portage. September was on us, and the days grew shorter and sharp at either end. We were in a veritable untrodden land now. The mountains were close upon us. The portages grew more frequent, the way more rough and toilsome. Norton, the leathery-skinned old prospector, informed us curtly one morning, 4 more days, and we're there. That day we abandoned the canoe, caching it safely in shrubbery and underbush. For 2 days we pressed upward, packing across a ridge that tested our strength to the utmost. The morning of the 3rd day found us once more on water. We had reached a deep, swift river, a stream that flowed to the north. We had crossed the divide and were on a tributary of the Mackenzie. From a cunning cache Norton drew forth another canoe, and we sped at ease down the stream. And then came the tragedy. It was noon of the 4th day. From round the bend in the river we heard the unmistakable roar of rapids. "Portage?" queried Dan of our guide. Norton shook his head. "Shoot her," he answered curtly. A moment later we swung round the bend. Before us the banks drew suddenly closer together, and the river narrowed and shot down between granite walls. The channel was checkered with boulders. Around them the tortured waters spat and hissed, flung themselves high in unavailing anger, yelled their rage in deafening uproar. Dan and I glanced questioningly. One narrow channel we could see, perilously narrow, perilously swift, but it was too late to reconsider. Already the waters, quickened beneath us, bore us on with an insidious smoothness that was belied by the speed with which the canyon walls shot by. Norton sat poised at the bow, alert, ready. Murdoch and I gripped our paddles. In a moment we were in it. With sickening speed we shot into the turmoil. The roar rang in our ears terrifyingly. Spray shot over and drenched us. We battled furiously, plunging our paddles deep as Norton signaled us. The light craft seemed to leap and bound, like a runner at the hurdles, gathering impetus at each new thrust. Then a rock seemed to leap up in our very path. Dan, kneeling amidships, gave a cry of terror and plunged wildly with his paddle. The delicately balanced boat swayed, lost for a moment its poise, slewed sideways. A splintering crash, and I found myself in the seething water. How I lived I do not know. I was a strong swimmer, but in that blind turmoil skill availed little. I was borne headlong. I was conscious of boulders bludgeoning me cruelly, but suddenly the waters grew quieter. I was swept into an eddy at the foot of the canyon. Somehow I struck out weakly and blind, breathless, and beaten, drew myself on a gravelly bar. How long I lay there I can only guess. Bit by bit my strength returned. I sat up. I was on the edge of a mountain meadow through which the stream swept, still foaming and boisterous. The thunder of the canyon came to me noisily. The sound of it called me suddenly to a realization of my position. I strove to rise. A sickening, terrible pain shot through me, and as I dropped back to the sand I knew that my left leg was shattered. It was not long before I knew the worst. Murdoch and Norton were dead. I could not doubt the truth. Dan, as I knew, could not swim, and even had he been an expert swimmer, it would be but through blind good fortune that any man could live in that seething torrent. By such blind luck I had been saved. For what? Crippled, alone, with neither food nor shelter, in a wilderness hundreds of miles from human aid, with winter hanging imminent, what chance did I have? Saved, yes, for death, by slow torture. For a moment, as the realization sent a sick despair through me, I was tempted to plunge once more into the river and let the waters finish their work. But I dismissed the cowardly impulse. I would not despair. I would not die. I took a more careful review of my surroundings. For the first time I saw, on the bank not 100 yards away, a cabin, a mere pen of mud-plastered logs, but still a cabin. On the hillside above it was a scar in the earth. It was Norton's cabin, Norton's mine. But Norton was dead. The sight gave me new courage. There was yet hope. I dragged myself to a kneeling position, gritting my teeth until the pain cleared a bit, and then began to creep toward the cabin. It was torture every inch of the way. Twice I fainted with the sheer agony, but I kept on. It had been noon when we neared the canyon. The sun was setting when I drew my body across the cabin door and fell in a stupor on the floor. There I lay until morning. The pale dawn found me tossing in a high fever. I must have been delirious for days, but after a time I woke, very weak, but rational. I began to take stock of my surroundings. I had hoped to find the cabin well stocked with provisions. A hasty survey proved that my hopes were vain. The tiny room was almost barren. A hand-made cupboard stood in one corner, but it was all but empty. A driblet of flour, a strip of mouldy bacon, a few shreds of jerked venison. Again despair shook me nauseatingly. Again I banished it with grim resolve. With the scant supply of wood I built a fire, dragging myself somehow around the room to get what I needed. There was water in a pail by the fireplace. I brewed the jerked meat for an hour. The resultant mixture was a weak, tasteless broth. Yet it was food, the first I had tasted for days. I drank some of it and felt stronger. My shattered leg had begun to knit. I had set it as best I could before the fever took me. Now it pained greatly, but with the aid of an old broom that I found I made shift to move around, and again hope flared warm in my heart. I built the fire high and crawled under the robes in Norton's bunk. In the night I woke uneasily. First I was conscious of the throbbing in my leg. Then I realized that what had aroused me was the sound of the wind roaring and shrieking past the walls, yelling like a horde of demons without. Above my head was a window, made of caribou skin scraped parchment thin, and against this I could hear the spit and rattle of snow. The fire had died to embers, and a bitter chill crept through the cabin. Winter had come. At dawn it was still storming. For 3 days the blizzard kept up. I huddled in my robes, fed the fire from the diminishing pile of wood, ate sparingly of the scanty food. And again the fear began to play upon my heart with chill fingers. Again I strove to banish it with grim resolve. On the fourth day the snow ceased, but the wind remained unabated. It grew terribly cold, and on that day my woodpile dwindled to nothing. My last scrap of food vanished. It grew colder. I kept the fire burning carefully, feeding it bit by bit, the scanty furniture that Norton had made with axe and hammer. I husbanded every bit, crouching over the merest spark of a flame, wrapping my thin body in robe and fur to conserve the precious warmth. And still the storm raved around the cabin. Still the screaming wind drove the snowflakes against the windows, through badly chinked crevices, a malicious, devilish wind that seemed, to my disordered brain, to be an embodied spirit of evil bent on my destruction. And still the cold penetrated, mocking my efforts to stave it off. Hunger and cold and pain combined to sap my strength. I grew delirious. For hours I forgot where I was, lived again the hours I had spent with Jane, saw her as I remembered her, a slim, exquisite thing, dark of hair, luminous of face, a spirit thing, too fine for man's possession. And again I pressed her in my arms, and swore that I would return. Waking from such visions, the will to live burned very strong in me. I would live, I would return. I swore it. Death could not conquer me, could not conquer love. Yet all the time I grew weaker. The flame of life flickered lower in my emaciated body. The body was dying. I knew it. It scarce had strength now to cast more wood on the dying fire. Within it the pulse of existence flickered feebly. But never was the real me more alive. I burned fiercely with the desire to live. I swore I should not die. Then one morning I awoke. The fire was out. Yet I was not cold. I attempted to rise. My body did not answer. I attempted to speak. No words came. Then I knew. In the night the body had died. It lay there now, stiff, still. It had ceased to live. But I was not dead. I could see my body lying there, a cast-off thing. But I was here, the entity that was. I had not perished with the flesh. The will to live was still mine. And I was alive. I was infinitely alive. My perceptions were 100 times clearer. I saw, I heard, I felt, as I never had before. And it seemed as if my whole being were concentrated in the one desire to see Jane, to tell her I still lived. And then there shot through my brain a terrible, sickening thought. To all the world's knowledge I was dead. I was no longer flesh, but spirit. I could see Jane, no doubt, but I could never make myself known to her. I had lost her. The most exquisite torture of soul racked me as the realization came. I was not dead. There was no death. My will had conquered it, but I was hopelessly and forever exiled from the world I had known. That warm, familiar world that held love and so many other things was forever taken away from me. Hopelessly exiled. Again my will revolted at the thought. Why was I forever condemned to such exile? There lay the body. It had ceased to live, in truth. I had shed it as one does a garment. But why could I not don it again? The body had stopped because of external physical reasons. The soul had fled because living soul could not inhabit dead flesh. But if the physical conditions that had ended life were removed, could not the soul again restore it to life? If aid, food, warmth were to come, could I not live again in the body? And so I waited. Soul kept vigil over body in that room. The two that had been linked so inextricably for 31 years, now divorced so irrevocably. You call it bizarre? That is because I tell it to you thus. How do you know but that it has happened times without number? You have watched by dead bodies, perhaps. How do you know that strange, invisible guest may not have shared the vigil with you? And so I waited. Night came. The wind had died a little outside, and through the cold I heard the distant howl of wolves. Again the howls came, and closer this time. It was a pack in full cry, spurred on by hunger, questing through the frozen solitudes for food. And now I could hear them in the clearing, and suddenly I realized what they sought. Forgetting my impotence, I strove with desperate hands to bar the door more tightly. I seized my rifle, or tried to seize it. It was vain. Spirit has no fear from dangers of this world. Equally, it has no means of defense. Round the cabin the wolves circled cautiously. I could hear them sniffing at the door. Then one brute dashed himself against the panels. The stout frame quivered, but held. A long-drawn howl came. It thrilled me with terror. Then another clawed at the caribou skin of the window. A gleaming claw shot through. A pair of slavering jaws followed. In a minute they were in. Can you dream of a thing so horrible as to watch your own body being torn apart by wild beasts? They snarled. They fought. Their fangs clipped and tore. I grew sick with despair. The night was hideous with their snarls and yowling. Unable to endure it, I fled, and horror tore at my heart. For now I knew I was indeed exile. The fleshly cloak that I had forsaken, that I had hoped to resume, was torn, destroyed. I had only one wish now, to see Jane again, even though I could not speak to her, could not hold her in my arms. To see her at least, bitter as it would be, was still consolation. There are no bounds of time or space to the unfettered soul, and so I found myself, without knowing how, in that long, home-like room where we had sat so often, with the fire flaming cheerily on the great hearth, the friendly books and pictures, everything that was so good a setting for the girl I loved. In the quiet peace of it, I forgot that desolate solitude, that cabin with its howling, fighting inmates. Jane was seated reading by the window, but as I watched she laid aside the book and sat looking out of the window across the silent moonlit fields. And I saw 2 tears glide from her eyelashes and glisten on her cheeks. She spoke my name. That evidence of her love was more than I could bear. I knelt beside her, strove to take her in my arms, whispered 1,000 broken endearments. And she sat pensive, unresponsive, utterly unconscious of me. The tragedy smote me again. I was spirit. She spirit in flesh. I was exiled. And with the ecstasy of despair, there flamed once more in me that dogged, unreasoning will to live again, I must say. And with it I fled the room, guided somehow, blindly by a new hope. I found myself in another house, in a bedroom that was very quiet, with an unnatural silence. In the bed lay a man. I knew him. It was my old friend, Gordon Page. There were others too. Gordon's mother sat with her face in her hands. His sister, her eyes dry and bright, knelt beside her and pressed her in comforting arms. Then I saw the white-haired doctor turn mutely away, and I knew why I had come. The body of Gordon Page lay there, inert, lifeless. With all the power I knew, I willed myself toward it. The body of Gordon Page stirred. He spoke. The light of sanity came back into his dead eyes. The doctor turned to him in amazement. A minute later, he turned again. He lives. God knows how, but he lives. The crisis is past. He will recover. And he did recover. The body of Gordon Page won back to life and health, but the soul within his body was the soul of Malcolm Ray. What is soul? What is self? I speak to you with the voice of Gordon Page. I write, and the handwriting is that of Gordon Page. But the entity that dwells in the body of Page, I am Malcolm Ray. In the spring they brought the news of Malcolm Ray's death to Jane Cavanaugh. She loved him. She was heart-broken, but she found comfort in the presence of her old friend, Gordon Page. We were married last week, Jane and I. It was in June, just a year after the June in which Ray had promised to return. When I told Jane I loved her, she said, "I do love you, Gordon, but sometimes it seems wrong, after poor Malcolm dying. But you're like him, Gordon. You're so like Malcolm that I can't blame myself for caring. I wish I could tell her that I am Malcolm, but the world is too incredulous. I do not dare." If you enjoyed these stories, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment. Thanks for listening to The Eldritch Narrator.